The rain fell hard that Tuesday evening, turning the police station parking lot into a maze of puddles. Officer James Reynolds pulled his jacket collar up as he hurried toward the back entrance of the precinct. His shift had been long and frustrating, a car chase that ended nowhere, paperwork piling up, and a sergeant who kept breathing down his neck about community relations. 3 years on the force had hardened Reynolds in ways he didn't notice anymore. The neighborhood around the precinct had changed since he first joined, more diverse faces, different languages spoken on the street corners. Reynolds didn't like change. He'd grown up in a town where everyone looked like him, thought like him. Now he carried those small-town views into every interaction, a silent judge behind his badge. The back entrance to the precinct was supposed to be for officers only, a security measure. So when Reynolds spotted a black woman in plain clothes trying to open the door with what looked like a key card, something inside him snapped. She wore simple black pants and a buttoned-up coat, her hair pulled back neatly. Nothing flashy or suspicious, but Reynolds didn't see that. He only saw someone who didn't belong. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he shouted, splashing through puddles as he approached her. The woman turned, calm and collected, reaching for something in her pocket. She began, but Reynolds cut her off. "Step away from the door. Hands where I can see them." His voice carried across the parking lot, drawing the attention of 2 officers having a smoke break under the covered area nearby. The woman's expression changed from surprise to something deeper, a look Reynolds had seen before but never understood. It was the look of someone who had been through this too many times before. "Officer, I'm trying to show you my—" Reynolds didn't wait. He moved forward quickly, grabbing her arm and shoving her against the brick wall beside the door. The woman's shoulder hit the wall hard, her belongings dropping to the wet pavement. A leather wallet fell open, something metallic glinting inside. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," Reynolds hissed, his face inches from hers. "This entrance is for police only. Can't you read the sign? Or is that too much to ask?" The woman didn't struggle against his grip, which only irritated Reynolds more. She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze unflinching despite the rain now soaking her face. "If you would just look at my identification," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. "What, some fake ID? Save it for someone who cares," Reynolds sneered. "I'm sick of dealing with troublemakers in this neighborhood. You're all the same." The officers from the smoking area were moving closer now, their cigarettes forgotten. One of them, Officer Chen, looked concerned. The other, a veteran named Rodriguez, had a strange expression, something between shock and horror. "Reynolds," Rodriguez called out, his voice careful. "You might want to." "I got this," Reynolds shouted back, not taking his eyes off the woman. "Just another trespasser thinking they can go wherever they want." The woman took a deep breath. Despite being pinned against the wall, there was a dignity in her stance that made Reynolds uneasy. She didn't look scared. If anything, she looked disappointed. "My name," she said clearly, each word measured, "is Captain Amara Williams. I've been transferred from the 42nd Precinct to take command of this station, effective yesterday. The key card you saw me using was issued to me by the Commissioner himself." The air seemed to freeze around them. Reynolds's grip loosened slightly as his brain struggled to process her words. "Captain? This woman was his new boss?" From behind him, Reynolds heard footsteps splashing through puddles. Lieutenant Garcia appeared at his side, face pale despite the cold. "Captain Williams," Garcia said, his voice full of apology. "I'm so sorry about this misunderstanding." He shot Reynolds a look that could have melted steel. Reynolds slowly backed away, his hands suddenly feeling too heavy at his sides. The woman, Captain Williams, straightened her coat with deliberate movements, her eyes never leaving Reynolds's face. "My office," she said simply. "Now." The walk to Captain Williams' office felt like the longest journey of Reynolds' life. Every step down the hallway seemed to echo his mistake back at him. Officers stopped their conversations to watch as he passed, their eyes following him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. News traveled fast in a police station. Lieutenant Garcia walked beside Captain Williams, speaking in a low, apologetic tone, while Reynolds trailed behind them like a scolded child. His mind raced with excuses, explanations, and defenses, none of which seemed good enough now. The captain's office still had boxes stacked in the corner, not yet unpacked. A framed photo sat on the desk. Captain Williams in dress uniform receiving an award, her smile proud but humble. A diploma from the FBI Academy hung on the wall beside certificates for advanced training in crisis management and community policing. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Captain Williams said as they entered. "Would you mind giving Officer Reynolds and me a moment?" Garcia nodded, shooting Reynolds a look that clearly said, "Fix this," before closing the door behind him. Captain Williams didn't immediately sit behind her desk. Instead, she stood by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city. The silence stretched between them until Reynolds couldn't stand it anymore. "Captain, I didn't know whoa." "Stop," she said, turning to face him. "Before you continue, I want something to be very clear. This isn't about you not recognizing me as your captain." She moved to her desk, picking up a folder that Reynolds hadn't noticed before. His name was written on the tab. "This is about how quickly you resorted to force when speaking would have been enough. This is about the words you chose to use. This is about assumptions you made based on nothing but the color of my skin." Reynolds felt a drop of sweat roll down his back despite the air conditioning. "I was just doing my job. The back entrance is restricted." "And you think I don't know that?" Captain Williams opened the folder. 3 complaints in the past year for excessive force. All 3 involved people of color. All 3 were dismissed because your fellow officers backed your story. She looked up at him. "Was that just doing your job too?" Outside the office, officers were gathering, trying to look busy while stealing glances through the glass walls. Reynolds saw Officer Chen whispering to Rodriguez, their faces serious. "Those situations were different," Reynolds said, his voice sounding hollow even to himself. "Those people were resisting arrest." Captain Williams sat down behind her desk, motioning for Reynolds to take a seat across from her. When he did, she leaned forward. "Tell me something, officer. When you saw me at that door, what was the first thought that went through your mind?" "Before I said a word, before I did anything but stand there with a key cup in my hand, what did you think?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth was too uncomfortable to admit. He'd seen a black woman at a restricted door and immediately assumed she was trespassing, up to no good, breaking rules that didn't apply to her. He hadn't considered any other possibility. "That's what I thought," Captain Williams said after his silence stretched too long. "The problem isn't that you didn't recognize your new captain. The problem is that you didn't see a person deserving of basic respect." From outside the office came a commotion. Chief Thompson had arrived, his face grim as he nodded to officers in the bullpen. He was heading straight for the captain's office. "Sir, you should know Captain Williams just got here yesterday," Lieutenant Garcia was saying, trying to keep pace with the chief. "The incident was unfortunate, but—" "Unfortunate?" Chief Thompson's voice carried through the glass. "I've got the mayor calling me because someone posted a video of my officer shoving the first black female captain in department history against a wall. Unfortunate doesn't begin to cover it." Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. Someone had recorded the incident. Captain Williams stood up as Chief Thompson entered the office without knocking. She remained composed, professional, exactly what a captain should be in a crisis. "Chief Thompson, I was just discussing the situation with Officer Reynolds." The chief looked between them, then focused on Reynolds. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Badge and gun on the desk. "Sir, I believe as his commanding officer, that decision falls to me," Captain Williams said calmly. The room went silent. Everyone knew she was right. Discipline for a patrol officer came from their direct superior. But no one had expected her to challenge the chief, especially not in defense of the officer who had just assaulted her. Chief Thompson's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you plan to do about this, Captain?" The tension in the office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Thompson's face had turned a shade of red that Reynolds had never seen before. But Captain Williams stood her ground, calm as still water despite the storm brewing around her. "With all due respect, Chief," she said, her voice steady, "escalating this situation publicly won't help our department or community relations. I have a different approach in mind." Chief Thompson crossed his arms. "The mayor wants blood, Captain. This video is already spreading online. People are demanding action." "And they'll get it," Captain Williams assured him. But firing Officer Reynolds without addressing the underlying issues will just lead to hiring someone new with the same problems. The cycle continues. Reynolds sat frozen in his chair, feeling like he was watching his career and life crumble in slow motion. He'd never imagined his day would end like this when he woke up this morning. Captain Williams turned to face Reynolds directly. 6 weeks suspension without pay. Reynolds felt a momentary relief that quickly vanished as she continued. During that time, you'll complete the department's full bias training program. Not the 2-day seminar everyone takes, the comprehensive 6-week course. You'll also volunteer 20 hours a week at the community center in the neighborhood you patrol. Captain, that's... Reynolds started to protest. Not negotiable, she finished for him. You'll also undergo weekly evaluations with Dr. Patel, our department psychologist, and with me personally. Chief Thompson frowned. That's a lot of departmental resources for one officer. Maybe it would be simpler to just cut him loose. Captain Williams shook her head. Then what message are we sending? That we throw people away instead of holding them accountable. That we don't believe people can change. She looked back at Reynolds. I'm not giving you a second chance, officer. I'm giving you a choice to earn one. The chief seemed to consider her words, his anger slowly giving way to reluctant consideration. And if he refuses this opportunity, then he resigns, Captain Williams said simply. Today. Reynolds looked between them, the reality of his situation sinking in. I don't understand. Why would you do this? After what I did? Because I didn't become a cop to punish people, Captain Williams said. I became a cop to protect and serve. Sometimes that means protecting people from their worst instincts and serving the greater good by helping them become better. She turned back to Chief Thompson. I'll handle the press statement. We acknowledge the incident, condemn the behavior, and outline the steps we're taking. Transparency is key. The chief stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. It's your call, Captain. But if this backfires, it'll be on me, she finished. I understand. Chief Thompson walked out, leaving Reynolds alone with Captain Williams. The officers who had been watching through the glass quickly pretended to be busy with paperwork. Reynolds struggled to find words. I don't deserve this. No. Captain Williams agreed. You don't. But this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what this department and community need. She sat on the edge of her desk. Tell me something, Reynolds. Why did you become a police officer? The question caught him off guard. He'd been asked it during his academy interview, of course, but that was years ago. Back then, his answer had been full of idealism and purpose. I wanted to help people, he said quietly, surprised to find he still meant it. My uncle was a cop. He was the best man I knew. Always fair, always kind. He used to say the badge wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. Something softened in Captain Williams' expression. What would he think about today? Reynolds felt shame wash over him like a physical pain. He'd be disappointed. He wouldn't recognize me. Maybe that's your first assignment then, Captain Williams said. Figure out how you got from there to here. Badge and gun on the desk. You'll get them back when, if you earn them. With shaking hands, Reynolds removed his badge and placed it on the desk, followed by his service weapon. Report to Dr. Patel tomorrow morning at 9, Captain Williams instructed. The community center expects you at noon. Don't be late. As Reynolds turned to leave, Captain Williams added, This is the hard path, officer. Much harder than getting fired and blaming me for the rest of your life. The question is, are you strong enough to take it? Reynolds paused at the door, feeling the eyes of the entire precinct on him. His whole body wanted to lash out, to blame, to make excuses. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice that sounded like his uncle cut through the noise. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'll be there. As he walked through the bullpen toward the exit, no one would meet his eyes. No one except Officer Chen, who gave him a slight nod that somehow carried both disappointment and encouragement. Outside, the rain had stopped, but Reynolds had never felt more exposed. News of what happened spread through the precinct like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone had picked a side. The break room became an invisible battlefield with officers clustering in small groups, voices lowering whenever someone from the other side walked in. She's just flexing her power, Officer Daniels muttered to his small circle of supporters. Making an example of Reynolds to show us who's boss. Across the room, Officer Chen shook her head. Did you even watch the video? What Reynolds did was wrong, plain and simple. We all make mistakes, another officer chimed in. But 6 weeks? Community service? That's overkill. Officer Washington, one of the few black officers in the precinct, had stayed quiet during most of these discussions. But today, he'd had enough. Overkill would have been firing him on the spot, Washington said, his deep voice silencing the room, which is exactly what would have happened to any of us if we'd done the same to a white captain. Uncomfortable silence followed as officers looked down at their coffee cups. Lieutenant Garcia entered, sensing the tension immediately. Don't you all have work to do? Those reports won't file themselves. As officers scattered, Garcia noticed Captain Williams watching from the doorway. She'd heard everything. Quite the united front we have here, she said with a hint of sarcasm as she stepped into the now empty break room. They'll come around, Captain, Garcia assured her, pouring a cup of coffee. Change takes time. Time is something we don't have much of, Captain Williams replied, accepting the coffee he offered. The community is watching us closely. That video has over 100,000 views now. The official statement helped, Garcia noted. Being transparent about the incident and the consequences has calmed some of the public outrage. Captain Williams nodded, but not all of it, and certainly not the internal division. She looked around the empty break room. I need your help, Lieutenant. You've been here longer than anyone. They trust you. Garcia raised an eyebrow. What do you need? Honest feedback. Eyes and ears open. I can't fix what I don't know is broken. Meanwhile, across town, Reynolds sat uncomfortably in Dr. Patel's office. The psychiatrist was a small man with kind eyes behind thick glasses who didn't seem at all intimidated by Reynolds' scowl. So, Dr. Patel said after Reynolds had been silent for 10 minutes straight, are we going to talk, or shall we just sit here staring at each other for the full hour? What's there to talk about? Reynolds grumbled. I messed up. I'm being punished. Dr. Patel tilted his head. Is that what you think this is? Punishment. What else would you call it? An opportunity, perhaps, Dr. Patel suggested. Captain Williams could have fired you. Instead, she's investing in you. Reynolds scoffed. She's making an example of me. And you're making excuses, Dr. Patel replied calmly. Let's try something different. Tell me about your uncle, the one who inspired you to become an officer. Reynolds looked up, surprised. How do you know about him? Captain Williams briefed me. She thought it might be a good starting point. Something about that bothered Reynolds. The captain had actually taken the time to share personal details about him, things that might help. It didn't fit with the villain he'd built her up to be in his mind. After his session, Reynolds drove to the community center in the heart of the neighborhood he usually patrolled. He'd driven past this building hundreds of times, but had never been inside. The colorful mural on the outside wall depicted people of various backgrounds working together to build a bridge. Inside, kids of all ages played basketball, did homework, or participated in art projects. A woman with gray straight hair approached him. You must be Officer Reynolds, she said, not extending her hand. I'm Mrs. Thomas, the center director, Captain Williams called ahead. Reynolds nodded awkwardly. Where do you want me to start? Mrs. Thomas pointed to a group of teenage boys shooting hoops. Those young men have had their fair share of run-ins with police, none of them good. Her eyes narrowed. You're going to help coach their basketball team. Reynolds stared at her in disbelief. I don't know anything about coaching basketball. Then you'll learn, she said firmly. Just like they're learning to trust people who wear your uniform. It's a two-way street, Officer Reynolds. As Reynolds approached the court, the teenagers noticed him immediately. The playing stopped. One tall boy with eyes too old for his young face picked up the ball and held it protectively. What's he doing here? The boy asked Mrs. Thomas. Officer Reynolds is your new assistant coach, she explained. He'll be here 3 days a week. The silence was deafening until another boy spoke up. That's the cop from the video. The one who pushed the lady captain. Reynolds felt his face burn with shame as all the boys stared at him, their expressions ranging from anger to curiosity to fear. Yes, Mrs. Thomas said simply. And now he's here to learn from his mistakes, just like I've always told you all to do. She handed Reynolds a whistle and walked away, leaving him alone with a dozen skeptical teenagers and 1,000 doubts. Reynolds pulled into his driveway late that evening, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. His first day with the teens at the community center had been a disaster. They'd ignored him, challenged him, and one kid had deliberately thrown a basketball that hit him in the back. Mrs. Thomas had watched it all without stepping in, her eyes saying she expected him to handle it himself. The lights were on in his house. His wife Lali was probably waiting up for him, though he told her not to. Their 6-year-old daughter May would be asleep by now. He sat in his car for a few extra minutes, trying to find the energy to go inside and face his family. Rough day? Lily asked as soon as he walked through the door. She was curled up on the couch with a book, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "You could say that," Reynolds mumbled, dropping into a chair. Lily closed her book. "Want to talk about it?" "Not really." He rubbed his face with his hands. "How much does May know?" "She knows you're taking some time off work to help at a community center," Lily said carefully. "She's excited about it, actually. Told her whole class her daddy is helping kids play basketball." A wave of shame washed over Reynolds. His daughter's simple pride in him felt undeserved. "Why did you do it, James?" Lily asked suddenly. It was the first time she directly asked about the incident. She'd been supportive when he came home with the news of his suspension, helping him figure out how they'd manage financially for 6 weeks, but she hadn't pressed him for details. "I don't know," he admitted. "I saw her at the door and just reacted." "That's not an answer," Lally said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've changed over the last couple of years. You used to come home with stories about helping people. Now all you talk about is the troublemakers in that neighborhood." Reynolds wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. When had he started seeing the people he was supposed to protect as enemies? "There's this kid at the center," he said instead. "Tall, maybe 15. Looks at me like he's just waiting for me to prove I'm exactly the cop he thinks I am." "And what kind of cop is that?" Lily asked. Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next morning, Reynolds met with Captain Williams for their first weekly check-in. Her office looked different now, more settled, with family photos arranged neatly and a small plant on the windowsill. "How was your first day at the center?" she asked without preamble. "Terrible," Reynolds answered honestly. "Those kids hate me." "Did you expect them to welcome you with open arms?" Captain Williams raised an eyebrow. "Trust is earned, Officer Reynolds. Especially trust that's been broken." "They don't even know me," Reynolds protested. "But they know the uniform," Captain Williams replied. "Every negative interaction they've had with an officer has shaped their view of all officers, just like your limited interactions with people who don't look like you have shaped your view of them." The truth of her words stung. "Dr. Patel says you spoke about your uncle," she continued, changing the subject slightly. "He sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Reynolds agreed, a lump forming in his throat. "He would have been so disappointed in me." Captain Williams nodded slowly. "Use that. Let it guide you." "It's not that simple," Reynolds said, frustration creeping into his voice. "You're asking me to change overnight." "No," Captain Williams corrected. "I'm asking you to start changing today, and then again tomorrow, and the day after that." She leaned forward. "Change isn't an event, Reynolds. It's a process." After their meeting, Reynolds found himself driving past his usual spots in the neighborhood he patrolled. Without his uniform and badge, he felt strangely vulnerable. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: the community garden tucked between buildings, the mural painted by local kids, the older men playing chess in the park. At a stoplight, he found himself next to a patrol car. Officer Washington was behind the wheel, looking surprised to see Reynolds. After a moment of hesitation, Washington gave him a small nod. Not friendly, but not hostile either. It felt like a tiny crack in a very thick wall. That evening at home, Reynolds found May still awake, waiting for him. "Daddy, will you read me a story?" she asked, her small face hopeful. Reynolds sat on the edge of her bed, picking up her favorite book. "Once upon a time," he began, but May interrupted him. "Not that one. I want a new story." "What kind of story?" May thought for a moment. "A story about a police officer who helps people." Reynolds felt his throat tighten. I think I know one, he said softly. It's about a police officer who makes a mistake, a big one. But then he meets someone who shows him a different way to be a police officer, a better way. Does it have a happy ending? May asked, snuggling closer. I don't know yet, Reynolds admitted. He's still learning. Later, as Reynolds lay in bed beside his sleeping wife, he found himself thinking about the teen at the community center, about Captain Williams, about his uncle, and about May. For the first time since the incident, he felt something beyond shame and anger. It wasn't exactly hope, but it was something close to it, a small, fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to being the officer his uncle would have been proud of, the father May deserved. 6 weeks passed faster than Reynolds could have imagined. Each day brought new challenges, small victories, and painful realizations. At the community center, the teens had slowly, very slowly, started to warm up to him. Not trust exactly, but at least they no longer went silent when he walked into the room. It was his last day of suspension, and Reynolds felt a strange mix of emotions as he drove to the precinct for his final evaluation with Captain Williams. Relief that the ordeal was almost over, worry about facing his fellow officers again, and a surprising reluctance to leave the community center behind. The tall boy who had given him the hardest time, Anthony, had finally spoken directly to him yesterday. You coming back after tomorrow? Anthony had asked, bouncing a basketball as they closed up the gym. I don't know, Reynolds had answered honestly. I go back to regular duty. Anthony had nodded, his face unreadable. You different now. Still a cop, but different. The words had stayed with Reynolds all night. As he walked through the precinct doors, heads turned. Some officers nodded in greeting, others looked away. Lieutenant Garcia approached with a cup of coffee. Welcome back, almost, Garcia said, handing him the cup. Captain's waiting for you. How's it been? Reynolds asked, genuinely curious about what he'd missed. Garcia shrugged. Changing. Captain's been implementing new community engagement protocols. Weekly meetings with neighborhood leaders, ride-alongs with local teachers and pastors. Some of the old guard aren't happy, but results speak for themselves. Complaints are down 15% already. Reynolds took that in as he approached the captain's office. When he knocked, her voice called for him to enter. Captain Williams wasn't alone. Dr. Patel sat in one of the chairs across from her desk, and to Reynolds' surprise, Mrs. Thomas from the community center occupied the other. Officer Reynolds, Captain Williams greeted him. Please, take a seat. Reynolds remained standing. If this is my evaluation, I'd rather hear it straight. It is and it isn't, Captain Williams replied. Please sit. Reynolds reluctantly lowered himself into the remaining chair. I've asked Dr. Patel and Mrs. Thomas to join us because they've been integral parts of your journey these past 6 weeks, Captain Williams explained. Before I make my final decision about your return to duty, I wanted their input. Reynolds felt a flash of anger. So they decide my fate? No, Captain Williams said firmly. That responsibility is mine alone, but I value their perspectives. Dr. Patel spoke first. Officer Reynolds has attended all of our scheduled sessions, initially reluctant, but increasingly engaged. He's demonstrated genuine reflection on his attitudes and behaviors. Mrs. Thomas was less effusive. He showed up. Didn't quit when the kids gave him hell, which is more than I expected. She paused. The basketball team has improved, and Anthony asked if he was coming back, which says something. Captain Williams nodded, making notes. And you, Officer Reynolds? What would you say you've learned? Reynolds hadn't prepared for this question, though perhaps he should have. He took a deep breath. I learned that I've been seeing threats where there weren't any, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. I've been policing people instead of protecting a community. I stopped seeing individuals and started seeing categories. He met Captain Williams' steady gaze. I'm not going to pretend 6 weeks fixed everything. I still catch myself making assumptions, but now I catch myself, and I question why I'm thinking that way. The room was quiet for a moment before Captain Williams spoke again. Your badge and gun are in the top drawer, she said, gesturing to her desk. But before you take them, I want to be very clear about expectations going forward. Reynolds nodded, waiting. You'll be partnered with Officer Washington for the next 3 months, she continued. You'll continue weekly sessions with Dr. Patel. and you'll volunteer at the community center one evening a week, on your own time. Reynolds blinked in surprise. Washington doesn't want to work with me, and the community center was part of my suspension. Officer Washington agreed to the arrangement. Captain Williams said, "As for the center, that's not a punishment, that's a commitment. Those kids are starting to connect with you. Walking away now would only reinforce what they already believe about police officers, that you don't really care about them." Mrs. Thomas stood up. "I should get back. Those kids aren't going to coach themselves." She looked at Reynolds. "Practice is Thursday at 6. Anthony's working on his three-pointer." After she left, Dr. Patel also excused himself, leaving Reynolds alone with the captain. "Why are you doing this?" Reynolds asked quietly. "Why did you fight for me when it would have been easier to fire me?" Captain Williams was silent for a long moment. "Because change doesn't happen by cutting out every problematic person. It happens by holding them accountable and giving them a path to do better." She leaned forward. "This precinct has issues bigger than just you, Reynolds. I need officers who've learned the hard way why change matters." Reynolds reached for the drawer but stopped with his hand on the handle. "I won't let you down, Captain." "Don't make promises," Captain Williams replied. "Just show up tomorrow and do the work, one day at a time." As Reynolds walked out of the precinct with his badge and gun back on his belt, he felt the weight of them differently than before. Officer Chen passed by, giving him a tentative smile. "Good to have you back," she said. "Good to be back," Reynolds replied, surprised to find he meant it. 3 months later, the precinct gathered in the community center gym. Folding chairs had been set up facing a small podium, and community members mingled with officers in an atmosphere that felt cautiously hopeful. The basketball court had been transformed with balloons and a banner that read, "Building Bridges Together." Reynolds stood near the back, tugging uncomfortably at his dress uniform collar. Officer Washington stood beside him, looking equally uncomfortable, but for different reasons. "Never thought I'd see this many people from the neighborhood willingly coming into a room full of cops," Washington commented. Reynolds nodded. "Captain's Community Advisory Board is working." "You're on that board now too," Washington reminded him. "Still can't believe you volunteered for more meetings." The past 3 months hadn't been easy. Working with Washington had been tense at first, filled with awkward silences and careful politeness. But responding to calls together, backing each other up, and debriefing their approaches had slowly built a working relationship that was starting to feel like actual partnership. Captain Williams approached them, clipboard in hand. "Everything ready for your presentation?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. Though I still don't understand why I'm doing this." "Because people need to hear it," she said simply. "From you specifically." As Captain Williams walked away to greet some community leaders, Washington gave Reynolds an encouraging nod. "You got this. Just speak from the heart." Reynolds spotted Anthony and some of the other teens from the basketball team filing in, taking seats near the front. Mrs. Thomas followed, giving Reynolds a small wave. His wife Lily and daughter May arrived last, May bouncing with excitement at seeing her daddy in his uniform. Captain Williams stepped up to the podium and the room quieted. "Thank you all for coming today," she began. "When I took command of this precinct 4 months ago, I promised change. Not just talk, but real, measurable improvement in how we police this community. Today is about showcasing some of that change and renewing our commitment to do better." She outlined the new programs, the Community Advisory Board, the Ride-Along program, the improved complaint process, the monthly town halls. Then she turned to introduce Reynolds. "Officer James Reynolds has a unique perspective to share today. Many of you know him from his work with the youth basketball program. Some of you may recognize him from a video that went viral a few months ago. All of you will benefit from hearing his story." Reynolds walked to the podium, his heart hammering in his chest. Public speaking had never been his thing, and speaking about his most shameful moments seemed impossible. But as he looked out at the faces, some suspicious, some supportive, all waiting, he found his voice. 4 months ago, I assaulted a woman trying to enter the police station," he began bluntly. "I didn't ask for ID. I didn't listen when she tried to explain. I saw her skin color and made assumptions about who she was and what she was doing. I was wrong. That woman turned out to be Captain Williams." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Not everyone knew the full story. "I could have been fired. Maybe I should have been. Instead, Captain Williams gave me something harder, the chance to confront my biases and change my behavior. Reynolds recounted his time at the community center, working with the basketball team, the weekly therapy sessions, and his partnership with Officer Washington. I'm not standing here claiming to be fixed or perfect, Reynolds continued. I still catch myself making assumptions. The difference is now I question them. I ask myself, why am I seeing this person as a threat? What evidence do I actually have? He looked directly at Anthony and the other teens. Working with these young men taught me more than I taught them. They had every reason to write me off as just another racist cop. But they gave me a chance to prove I could be better. Not everyone gets that chance. Reynolds turned to Captain Williams. Leadership matters. 4 months ago, this precinct was going through the motions. Now we're having real conversations about implicit bias, about community needs, about police accountability. That doesn't happen without someone willing to do the hard work of change from the top down. Finally, Reynolds addressed the community members directly. I understand if you're skeptical. Words are easy, but I invite you to hold us accountable. Sign up for ride-alongs, join the advisory board, file complaints if needed. This isn't about making us look good, it's about us actually doing better. As Reynolds returned to his seat, the applause was scattered but genuine. Captain Williams retook the podium to introduce the next speaker, but Reynolds wasn't really listening. Anthony had caught his eye and given him a thumbs up. Washington had clapped him on the shoulder, and May was beaming at him from her seat. After the program ended, people broke into small groups, officers and community members actually talking to each other instead of at each other. Reynolds found himself surrounded by teens from the basketball team. "Coach," Anthony said, suddenly seeming shy, "we got something for you." He handed Reynolds a small box. Inside was a whistle on a lanyard, with Coach Reynolds engraved on the side. "Mrs. Thomas said you're staying on as assistant coach even though your punishment is over," one of the younger boys explained. "So we thought you should have a real whistle." Reynolds looked at their faces, hopeful, cautious, but no longer fearful. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thursday at 6, right?" As the teens wandered off toward the refreshment table, Captain Williams appeared at Reynolds' side. "Good speech," she said. "Good leadership," he replied. Captain Williams looked around at the mingling crowd. "This is just the beginning, you know. Real change takes years, not months." Reynolds nodded, watching as Washington explained police equipment to fascinated children, as Mrs. Thomas deepened conversation with Lieutenant Garcia, as Lily chatted with other officers' spouses. "I'm in it for the long haul, Captain," he said, "one day at a time."